This is the story of Ziba, a former servant of King Saul who held the keys to a broken dynasty and found himself caught between loyalty and ambition. Once upon a time, in the soft hills of Gibeah, where olive trees clung to rocky soil and the wind whispered old names through the branches, there lived a man named Ziba. Most people in the region knew him as a hard-working steward. Quiet, watchful, always a step behind power but never far from it. But Ziba wasn't born into wealth. He had earned every crease in his hands, every line across his brow. Years ago, when King Saul ruled with strength and pride, Ziba had walked the palace halls not as a warrior, not as an advisor, but as a steward, a servant who watched, listened, and remembered. He knew every squeaky floorboard in the palace kitchens. He knew which officials liked their bread warm and which ones liked their wine too much. He was trusted. He was efficient. He made sure Saul's house ran like clockwork, and then the clock broke. The king fell. His sons were killed in battle. The royal house shattered like clay thrown against a wall. But Ziba didn't run. While others scrambled to align with the rising star of David, Ziba stayed behind to care for what was left, not out of blind loyalty, not even out of fear, but because someone had to. And what was left was a child, Mephibosheth, the lame son of Jonathan, the last living thread in Saul's bloodline. Ziba remembered the day they first brought the boy home from Lo-Debar, legs twisted, eyes tired, too quiet for his age. He had once watched the child crawl down the palace steps on his hands, dragging himself because there was no one to carry him. From that day on, Ziba had made sure someone did. He fed him, clothed him, hired servants to help, rebuilt what little dignity Mephibosheth had left. Over the years, the boy grew into a thoughtful, gentle man, more comfortable with books than with battle, more at home in the shadow of David's mercy than in the halls of his grandfather's palace. Ziba never spoke of it aloud, but sometimes, when he walked the old vineyards in the evening and felt the soil beneath his feet, a thought would surface. I'm the one who built this. I'm the one who kept it alive. Whose land is this really? He'd brush the thought away, most of the time. But quiet thoughts grow loud in moments of chaos, and chaos was coming. It was early morning when one of Ziba's sons burst through the orchard gate, panting, his cloak half dragging on the dirt path. "Abba!" the boy called, breathless. "News from the capital! King David has fled!" Ziba froze where he stood beneath a fig tree, sharpening a small blade used for pruning vines. The rasp of metal against stone stopped mid-stroke. "Say that again," he said slowly. The boy swallowed hard. "Absalom, his son, he declared himself king. There's been fighting in the city. David left in the night." Ziba didn't speak. He simply stared out at the horizon. The hills of Saul's old estate rolled outward like sleeping lions. The olive trees stood still, waiting. And somewhere beyond them, Jerusalem was cracking open. He gripped the blade tighter, then slowly set it down. David has fled. The throne is vulnerable. The kingdom is shifting. And Mephibosheth, still in Jerusalem, still loyal to David, still unable to run. Ziba felt a strange stillness settle in his chest. Not panic, not joy, something colder, heavier. "This is your moment," a whisper inside said. He stood in that orchard for a long time, alone, watching the sky turn from pink to gold. No one would know what he chose. Not yet. But Ziba did. And so did God. Ziba didn't sleep that night. Long after the sun set over the hills of Gibeah, he sat alone in the courtyard, a cup of wine untouched beside him, the stars pricking through the dark like silent witnesses. The estate was quiet, too quiet. Even the olive trees seemed to be holding their breath. His son's words echoed over and over in his mind. David has fled. Absalom is king. Everything had shifted. And in the silence of that orchard, Ziba heard it again. This is your moment. It came like a breeze at first, a gentle idea brushing across his mind. The king is gone. His throne is vulnerable. His allies scattered. And Mephibosheth, still in Jerusalem, still helpless, still believing in a king who's no longer wearing a crown. Ziba clenched his jaw. He stood and began pacing the courtyard in the dark, his feet brushing against scattered leaves and loose gravel. He thought of the estate, the vineyards, the servants who now looked to him before anyone else. He thought of the land deeded to Mephibosheth by David, but managed every day by Ziba. He thought of the loyalty he had given, years of it, and he wondered, what if this time it was returned? At first the idea felt wrong, disloyal. But then it began to twist. Was it really disloyal? If Mephibosheth had chosen David over his own legacy, was it betrayal? If Ziba had done all the work? He thought back to the early days, to the soft voice of a boy asking, "Do I still matter?" And to his own promise, more than ever. Ziba had meant it then, but now? Now he wasn't sure if that was love or just duty. And duty, when it lives too long without honor, begins to rot. By morning, Ziba had made his decision. He walked the estate with purpose, scanning the carts and stables. He ordered fruit to be loaded, raisins, summer figs, loaves of barley bread, skins of wine. Not too much to draw suspicion, just enough to look generous. The servants moved quickly, used to Ziba's quiet commands. No one asked questions, not even his sons. "Where are we going, Abba?" Eliab asked as they tied the last of the baskets. Ziba answered without looking up. "To find the king." Eliab blinked. "King David?" "Yes," Ziba said. "He's fled across the Jordan. He'll need supplies, comfort, loyalty." Eliab hesitated. "And Mephibosheth?" Ziba paused, then said, "He remained in the city. He made his choice." That was all he said, and that was all he had to say. By noon, the donkeys were saddled. The road stretched ahead, dry and dusty, curling through the hills like a snake hiding its fangs. Ziba mounted slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was something else. He told himself it was loyalty. But deep down, a second voice whispered something different. "It's your turn now." And Ziba, silent as always, didn't argue. He just rode. The road to the Jordan was long and hot. Dust curled beneath the donkey's hooves, rising in slow swirls as the small caravan wound through the hill country. Ziba rode in silence, flanked by two of his sons and followed by a trail of quiet servants pulling carts packed with food and wine. The sun beat down from above, but Ziba's thoughts burned hotter. This wasn't a reckless plan. It was precise, deliberate. Everything about it had been crafted to look like loyalty. But the truth was, this wasn't about Mephibosheth anymore. It was about what David would see, a steward delivering food, a man of Saul's house honoring the king in his hour of need, a tribute from the past to secure a future. Ziba wasn't lying, at least not with his mouth, but in his silence he had buried a blade. He would tell David that Mephibosheth stayed behind, that he was hoping to reclaim his grandfather's throne while David fled. He wouldn't have to say much, just enough to plant doubt. After all, Mephibosheth couldn't defend himself. Ziba gripped the reins tighter. The donkeys brayed softly as the road bent toward the river. The sky stretched wide and white above them, and in the distance, the smoke of many campfires drifted through the trees like a signal. David is here. Ziba's chest tightened. Soon, the king would see him. Soon, he would be thanked, rewarded, respected, seen, and still. A small part of him wondered what Mephibosheth was doing now, back in Jerusalem, alone, left behind by the one man he had trusted most. Ziba pushed the thought away. It's too late for second thoughts. They crossed the final ridge that overlooked the river valley, and there, nestled between the trees and rocks, David's exiled camp came into view. Hundreds of soldiers, tents in clusters, watchfires glowing, and in the middle, King David. He was seated on a large stone beneath a tree, robe draped over his shoulders, face drawn and tired. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a father mourning a war that hadn't finished hurting him yet. Ziba dismounted slowly and motioned for his sons to wait. He approached the king with measured steps, head bowed, hands open. David looked up. Ziba spoke with reverence. "My lord the king, I bring supplies for you and your people, bread, wine, fruit, and comfort for the weary." David stood. His voice was rough. "Ziba? Saul's servant?" "Yes, my king." David's eyes narrowed. "Where is your master? Where is Mephibosheth?" There it was. The moment. Ziba lowered his head a little more. Not too much, just enough. "He stayed in Jerusalem," he said quietly. "He believes the house of Israel will restore the kingdom to him." The words dropped like stones into deep water. David blinked. Once, twice. Then his face hardened, not with anger, but with weariness. "So be it," he said. "All that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." Ziba bowed deeply. "May I find favor in your eyes, my lord." He stayed low, eyes to the ground. He had gotten what he wanted, but something inside him didn't rise with him. As he backed away, the cheers of his servants rang quietly in his ears. But Ziba didn't speak, not even to his sons. He simply turned, mounted his donkey again, and stared at the road home. A gift had been given. But it was wrapped in silence, and silence, Ziba was learning, can speak louder than truth. The ride back to Gibeah was quieter than the ride out. Ziba rode ahead of the caravan, eyes fixed on the road, barely noticing the gentle hum of insects or the way the wind shifted through the barley fields. His sons followed behind, whispering now and then, casting glances at their father. To the servants, it looked like victory. Their master had gone to the exiled king and returned with land, authority, favor. Even the most skeptical among them now walked a little straighter in Ziba's presence. But Ziba himself felt heavier. The words he had spoken to David, so few, so careful, echoed louder than he expected. He stayed in Jerusalem. He believes the kingdom will return to him. Simple words, no shouting, no lies too bold, Just a twist, just enough. When they reached the estate, the workers gathered to hear the news. Ziba's sons unloaded the remaining supplies, and the people cheered as they heard what had happened. "The king gave him everything," one of the younger men said, "all of Mephibosheth's land. It belongs to our master now." Ziba raised a hand to quiet them, offering a polite smile. "Continue your work. We still have a harvest ahead." He turned and walked slowly toward the house. Inside, the shadows clung to the walls and the air was still. He sat down in the large chair by the window, the one Mephibosheth used to sit in whenever he visited. How many times had he carried him to that very spot? Ziba stared at the empty seat. He had won something. But what exactly had he won? Later that evening, his oldest son, Eliab, came to him. "Abba, are you all right?" Ziba nodded. "Yes." Eliab hesitated. "I was just thinking, if Mephibosheth really believed he'd take the throne again, why didn't he try harder? Why didn't he gather support?" Ziba looked up slowly. "Maybe because he didn't want a throne," Ziba said. "Then, why did you say he did?" Ziba didn't answer. He only turned his gaze out the window. The land was quiet, the vines full, the stone walls strong, but none of it felt steady anymore, because truth is a foundation, and Ziba had just traded his for more dirt. That night he walked the vineyards alone. The moon hung low, casting pale silver light on the fields he had worked for years. The same fields Mephibosheth had inherited, the same ones Ziba had claimed with a whisper. He knelt beside a young fig tree and ran his fingers through the soil. "This was supposed to feel like a reward," he murmured. But it didn't. It felt like a rope, tight and invisible, slowly wrapping around his name. He stood, dusted off his hands, and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, David was still in exile. And somewhere, Mephibosheth sat in silence, still loyal, still waiting, still unaware. And Ziba. Ziba stood in the dark, clutching land he now owned, and wondering if it had cost him something far greater. In the weeks that followed, life on the estate carried on. The olives were nearly ready for pressing. The barley fields had been trimmed low, and carts full of grain rolled steadily into storage barns. Servants moved through the courtyards with purpose, calling Ziba master now with a little more boldness than before. But even with land in his hand and titles on his lips, Ziba felt quieter. Not peaceful, just quiet. He didn't speak of the encounter with David again. He didn't boast or retell the story, not even when his sons asked for details. "Tell us again, Abba," his youngest said one morning. "What did the king say?" Ziba stirred his porridge with a wooden spoon. "He said the land was mine." "Just like that?" Ziba nodded. "Just like that." But his voice didn't carry the joy they expected. His sons exchanged glances, unsure whether to press or to let it go. That afternoon, Ziba visited the north field alone. He walked the rows of grapevines with slow, deliberate steps. These were the oldest vines, planted by Saul's men long before David ever wore a crown. Ziba had tended them for years, trimmed them, repaired their supports, protected them from blight and wind. He passed the old olive press where Mephibosheth had once sat on a warm autumn day, asking questions about how the process worked. That memory rose like dust from a stone path, unwanted, but impossible to avoid. "Why do you do so much, Ziba?" Mephibosheth had asked. Ziba had shrugged. "Because someone has to. Things fall apart when no one pays attention." "Then I'm glad you're here," the boy had said. so I don't fall apart too. Ziba stopped walking. He stared at the press, the handle still slightly bent, the stones stacked just as they'd been all those years ago. He had told David that Mephibosheth wanted the throne, that he was waiting to reclaim Saul's kingdom, that he'd stayed behind out of ambition, but Ziba knew something different. Mephibosheth had never asked for more. He'd only wanted to belong, to be remembered, to have a place that no one could take away. And Ziba had taken it. Not with a sword, not with shouting, but with one well-placed suggestion spoken to a weary king. He turned back toward the house, his chest tight with a pressure he didn't have words for. That night, a courier arrived from the city. No scroll, no message, just a name passed by mouth from traveler to traveler. Absalom is dead. David is returning. The servant whispered it at Ziba's door with trembling hands. Ziba said nothing. He only closed the door quietly and stood in the dark. The king was coming home, and with him, so was the truth. The king was returning. The words traveled faster than any scroll. They blew through the towns like a sudden wind, stirring doors open and setting dust to flight. No one had expected it so soon. But Absalom was dead, his rebellion cut down by the very men he had once hoped to lead. David, heartbroken yet victorious, was crossing the Jordan once more. Back to the throne, back to power, back to unfinished business. Ziba stood at the edge of the estate, staring down the road that led toward the capital. His cloak billowed behind him in the warm wind, but he didn't move. Behind him, servants buzzed with nervous energy. Some were excited, some were afraid. All of them were watching Ziba. His sons gathered near the main gate, waiting for their father's direction. Eliab finally stepped forward. "Abba, should we go to meet him, like before?" Ziba kept his eyes on the road. "I'm thinking," he said. But he wasn't thinking about honor, or loyalty, or even politics. He was thinking about Mephibosheth. The last time they had spoken, it had been short, rushed. Ziba had promised to make sure the estate was cared for. He had said he would return quickly. He hadn't. And now, Mephibosheth might be returning too. Ziba imagined him, still unable to walk, still dressed plainly, still loyal to the king who had once lifted him up. He could almost hear his voice. "Where were you, Ziba?" He clenched his jaw. He didn't have an answer that would sound right anymore. Later that day, news reached Gibeah that David had reached the other side of the river and would be passing through on his way back to Jerusalem, and not alone. The messenger whispered it quietly to Ziba. "Mephibosheth, he's coming too." Ziba's breath caught. He waved the messenger away and turned back into the house, closing the door behind him with trembling hands. He paced the great room, running a hand along the stone walls he had helped restore. He looked at the shelves he had stocked, the rugs he had chosen, the empty chair by the fire where Mephibosheth used to sit. He could still walk outside right now, ride to David's caravan, bring more fruit, more wine, more soft words. He could try to seal the story, but something stopped him. For the first time, Ziba didn't want to be seen. He wanted to hide. Because when the king came back, he came back with questions, and this time Mephibosheth would be there to answer them. That evening, Ziba stood alone in the vineyard. The sky was streaked with orange and rose. The land was quiet. He placed a hand on the trunk of the old fig tree and whispered, "I told myself it was loyalty." The wind stirred the leaves, but it wasn't. He looked toward the horizon one more time. The king was coming, and truth was marching with him. The next morning broke with a strange stillness. Birds chirped, workers moved through the vineyard, but the usual rhythm of the land felt off, like the trees were waiting for something. Ziba knew what it was. He didn't need a messenger to confirm it. He could feel it in the way his servants spoke more carefully, in how his sons paused at doorways before speaking, in the way the wind carried the scent of campfires from down the road. The king was near, and with him, Mephibosheth. Ziba stood at the gate as the caravan came into view. Dust clouded the air behind the soldiers. Behind them walked groups of elders and loyal supporters, all returning with the king. At the center rode David, tired, slow-moving, but unmistakably restored. And then, behind him, Mephibosheth. Ziba's heart pounded. He hadn't seen him in months. Not since the day he had left Jerusalem alone with baskets and bread and just enough words to twist a king's mind. Mephibosheth looked different. His clothes were worn, his beard untrimmed, his face pale, but he rode upright, gripping his cane in one hand, steady and focused. Ziba lowered his eyes as the caravan drew near. The moment came quickly. David dismounted. His eyes scanned the small crowd, and when they landed on Ziba, his expression changed. Not cold, not angry, just tired. "Ziba," he said. Ziba bowed low. "My king." David glanced toward Mephibosheth, who was now being helped down from his mule. David turned back. "Why did your master stay behind in Jerusalem when I fled?" Ziba didn't answer. Not because he didn't have a response, but because he no longer trusted the one he'd already used. He opened his mouth. But Mephibosheth spoke first. "My lord the king," he said, voice clear and calm, "I wanted to go with you. I ordered my donkey to be saddled, but Ziba left without me, and he slandered me before you." The words were not shouted. They were spoken like truth that didn't need to prove itself. David's face didn't move. "I have not trimmed my beard, or washed my clothes, or cared for my feet since the day you left," Mephibosheth continued, "because I was grieving for you. Not because I sought the throne, but because I feared I had lost the one man who showed me kindness." Silence fell like a stone in water. Ziba stared at the ground. He didn't deny it. He didn't defend himself. He only waited. David looked between the two men. One had brought him food, the other had brought him honesty, and kings know the difference. "You shall divide the land," David said finally. Ziba's head lifted just slightly, eyes wide with surprise, but Mephibosheth shook his head. "Let him have it all," he said quietly. "I am just glad my lord the king has returned in peace." David nodded and moved on. Mephibosheth didn't look at Ziba. He only turned back toward his mule and walked away. Ziba stood frozen. He had come to take everything, and in the end, he had been offered mercy by the very man he betrayed, and that mercy weighed more than any field he'd ever gained. Ziba didn't speak on the way home, not to his sons, not to his servants, not even to himself. He rode in silence through the winding hills of Gibeah, his back straight, his face calm, but inside something had cracked open. Mephibosheth had spoken the truth, not with anger, not with revenge, but with grief. Ziba had expected a confrontation. He'd imagined accusations, maybe a demand to punish him, to take the land back, but instead, Mephibosheth forgave him, publicly, quietly, fully, and Ziba had never felt so small. That night, as his sons sat around the fire, whispering about the day's events, Ziba remained in the shadows. He watched the flames flicker across their young faces, and he wondered what kind of man they thought he was now. Eliab finally broke the silence. He gave it all up. Ziba said nothing. He could have taken back the land, Eliab continued, but he let it go. All of it. Why? Ziba didn't look up, because some men value peace more than property. His younger son piped up, "But you worked for all this. Doesn't that matter?" Ziba finally met their eyes. His voice was low, but heavy with meaning. "It does matter," he said, "but truth matters more." The boys went quiet. The fire crackled between them. Ziba stood and stepped outside. The night was cool. The sky above the vineyard stretched wide and starless, as if even heaven had gone quiet. He walked the rows slowly, dragging his hand across the leaves. He remembered the first time Mephibosheth came to visit this land after David had restored it to him. How he had sat in a wooden chair beneath the fig tree, smiling shyly as the workers passed by, unsure whether to bow. Ziba had stood beside him like a wall, unmoving, unbending, proud to protect him. Now that same man had offered him everything, even after being betrayed, and somehow that was worse than judgment, because judgment would have made sense. But grace? Grace unraveled him. He dropped to his knees beneath the same fig tree and placed his hands on the earth. "I failed him," Ziba whispered. "I failed the one who trusted me most." No one answered. But the silence wasn't cruel this time. It was waiting. Ziba looked toward the city lights far in the distance. Maybe it's not too late to plant something honest. The next morning, Ziba rose before the sun. He stepped quietly over the threshold, careful not to wake his sons, and walked into the vineyard as the first light touched the hills. There was a softness to the morning, the kind that asked for honesty. The air was cool and the vines shimmered with dew. He moved among them without speaking, checking the soil, touching the leaves. But this time, it wasn't about control. It was about reflection. The land hadn't changed, but Ziba had. Later that day, he called the household together, his sons, the workers, the overseers. They gathered in the courtyard, curious. Ziba didn't speak loudly. He didn't stand on a platform. He simply stood beneath the old fig tree and looked them all in the eye. "I need to say something," he began. "You've served me well. You've honored this house and cared for this land. But what you don't know is that this land was never truly mine." The murmurs began instantly. Ziba raised a hand. "I told the king that Mephibosheth had turned against him, that he stayed behind to seize power, but that wasn't true. He stayed behind because I left him." The crowd went quiet. "I took what I did not earn. I twisted the truth, and I did it for gain. I cannot change what I said, but I can change what I do next." He looked down at his hands, hands that had built, carried, planted, but also taken. "I will write to Mephibosheth. I will return the land fully. I will ask to serve him again, not out of duty, but because it is right." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full of surprise, of understanding, of something holy. Eliab stepped forward slowly. "He already forgave you. Why go back now?" Ziba turned to his son, because forgiveness is a gift, but repentance is a choice, and I want to walk upright again, even if it costs me everything." That night, Ziba sat at his table with a fresh scroll and ink. His hands shook slightly as he wrote, line by line, slowly, carefully. "To Mephibosheth, I am no longer your steward in name, but if you will allow it, I would be your servant in truth. I stole what you entrusted to me. I twisted what should have been clean. And still, you forgave me. If there is a place for me in your household, I will take it, not to manage land, but to be a man you can trust. Ziba." He sealed the scroll with wax and handed it to a messenger. As the writer disappeared into the night, Ziba exhaled deeply. He had no idea what Mephibosheth would say. But this time, the silence felt lighter, like something had been released. Not ambition, not guilt, just the beginning of something honest. Ziba didn't expect an answer. After sending his letter to Mephibosheth, the letter where he finally admitted the truth, returned the land, and asked to serve again, he returned to working the vineyard as if nothing had happened. But something had. He no longer walked like a man defending territory. He walked like a man trying to become trustworthy again. Each morning, he checked the orchard gate. Each evening, he reminded himself, even if nothing comes back, I will live as if grace did. And then, 3 days later, a rider appeared on the horizon. No banner, no scroll, just a quiet messenger from Jerusalem with dust on his cloak and a message in his mouth. Ziba stepped forward, heart quiet but ready. "Mephibosheth sends no decree," the messenger said. "Only this. Tell Ziba there is still a seat for him at my table, not because he earned it, but because grace makes room." Ziba didn't speak. He simply nodded, turned, and walked back into the house. He packed no riches. He left the land in the care of his sons. And the next morning, he set out alone for Jerusalem, not as a landowner, but as a man who had been forgiven. When he arrived, there was no ceremony, no guards announcing his name, just the quiet steps of a man who once twisted truth and now wished to walk in it. Mephibosheth met him in the outer court of the palace. His hair was shorter, his face a little older, but his eyes still kind. "You came," Mephibosheth said. Ziba bowed low. "Not for land, not for titles, only for what I once left behind." Mephibosheth motioned toward a small table set beneath a fig tree. There were no other guests, no silver platters, just 2 chairs, bread, oil, and peace. Ziba approached slowly and took his seat. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Forgiveness had already said what words couldn't. And Ziba? He no longer sat at the head of an estate. He no longer carried the keys to a crumbling kingdom, but he had something better. A place at the table of someone he once betrayed. And that, at last, was enough.